Okay, good morning, folks. No eggs, no tomatoes here. All right. What we want to do here is talk to you about, what is happening in the embedded world with open source software in general. Okay. So Tim, Mike, David, Zach, if you could please come up here and grab a chair. Okay, so before we actually get started, if you guys could just present yourselves, what you guys do, so that everybody knows who you are. Please go ahead, David.
Thanks. I'm David Stewart. I'm an engineering manager at Intel, and hopefully my voice will stick around all day. I am a manager of our embedded Linux effort in the Open Source Technology Center, primarily working on the Yocto project.
I'm Mike Anderson. I'm Chief Technology Officer for the PTR Group. Been in the embedded business for a little over 37 years now. My first embedded systems programming assignment was an Intel 8080 back in 1976. So go back a ways.
Hi, my name is Tim Bird. I'm a senior staff software engineer at Sony Network Entertainment, and I work on Linux for various Sony products. I'm also involved with the CE work group of the Linux Foundation.
All right.
I'm Zach Pfeffer, and I'm the Android lead at Linaro, and I've been working on Android since it was a thing. And I've been working on embedded Linux for about, 12 years.
Awesome. All right, so what I want to do here is, before I actually lay the questions to the panel, I want to kind of go through about 4 or 5 slides just to actually lay the groundwork as to why we're even asking this question. Why do we need to ask this question, and kind of have a conversation around it. And I'll tell you right away that the answer can't be a flat yes. I mean, there's no way that that's happening. The question is, of course, a conversation starter. So just to kind of give you an idea here, these are some graphs I picked up from Ars Technica that ran an article in August, giving you kind of the market for smartphones between 2000 and 2006. As you can see, there's kind of like a spike somewhere in there for Linux, and then it kind of dies away, all right? Just kind of disappears out of the chart. And then somehow later on, kind of Android kind of takes off, all right? So, of course, we're here because Android is gaining a lot of traction in the market. And this is also kind of correlated to this chart here, where you can see that smartphones are outselling almost everything out there that lives and breathes. And this somewhat has an impact on software development in general. Okay. The other thing that I picked up at some point, actually through an article that the Linux Foundation was running on Linux.com, I think. So what operating systems are you? Are you currently using? As you can see, Android's up there alongside Ubuntu. And then what are you looking for in the next 12 months? And you can see that Android is pretty high on the chart. Okay, so this is what's prompting the question being asked here is, where are we going with all this? All right. So the first question I'd like to ask the panel here is, can you define what embedded Linux is and what is Android in contrast, so to speak?
Actually, the question of what embedded Linux is, I'd like to ask Tim to answer first. he told me that he had some other alternative. I'd like to actually see if he could answer first.
Okay, so...
Well, you got a mic on.
I got it. Yeah, they said my mic's not working, so...
Oh, there you
go. So I actually don't think that Android is embedded Linux.
Okay. Perfectly fine.
Well, so let me, but I have to tell you my definitions. Right?
Sure,
so
absolutely, absolutely.
Embedded to me means a single function device. Well,
Okay.
not a single function, but a fixed function device.
Okay.
Right? And for years, at least in the consumer electronics space, we've been dreaming about making platforms out of our devices, particularly television sets at Sony. How can we make application ecosystems around it and run third-party apps? And that's all well and good. That's great stuff, and we're seeing that happening. There's Google TV and all kinds of smart devices that allow applications to come on. But for me, that's not traditional embedded. And traditional embedded is, you know, when you bake it at the factory,
Right.
that's what it does, and that's what it will do for
Forever.
its entire life.
Right.
And so Android is more of a platform play. And I think that's kind of the big difference. Now, and what we're going to talk about, I guess, more today is, can you take a platform operating system and use it in embedded? And easy answer right out the chute is yes, but we'll talk more about some of the details. I
Sure, absolutely. Anybody who wants to pitch in?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
relative to kind of my understanding of embedded Linux is, you know, kind of separate. Embedded in general, I sort of think of as different than cell phones and tablets.
Sure.
So, and I think that's a relatively well understood, you know, division. So from my standpoint, I never want to say, well, you know, Android, I mean, my company, you know, does a lot with Android. I mean, we had Mark Skartmas here yesterday talking
Sure.
about all the investment and the tools that Intel's making in Android.
Right.
But primarily the focus is on the cell phone and tablet space. And then for the rest of the embedded, you know, we have focused on something different. And the Octo project is primarily the thing that we're trying to work with, you know, our partners like TI and Wind River and Mentor Graphics, and I'm sure I'm missing a ton of others. But generally the community, open embedded community, to try and deliver that bit.
Cool. Mike?
I think they pretty much covered it.
Yeah? All right. Jack?
I'm going to take a contrary and
What a surprise.
And, I'm going to say that Android is embedded Linux.
Okay.
I think
So can you define the former and the latter?
Well, I mean, what's an embedded system, right? I wouldn't say it's a non-upgradable, but it's a limitedly upgradable device.
Okay.
You tend to pull it together, and you know, you don't tend to upgrade the platform so much as you might upgrade, you know, user space or apps that run on it, and that's been going on forever in embedded Linux. So I think that Android is a successful is used successfully in the embedded Linux space because it actually is it achieves those goals that more traditional embedded Linuxes have been striving for a long, long time, and that's why it makes so much sense. So I think that, you know, embedded systems as a whole are just a means to an end, right? I want
Right.
to build a thing. I need an operating system because if I don't have an operating system, even if it's an executive, still an operating system, right? I need to make the chip work, and
Right.
you know, embedded Linux has been a good way to do that. And now that we're entering this world where we have SoCs that integrate so much technology, so many IP blocks, and these SoCs are connected in ways that we have never dreamed of before, that Android is just a particularly efficient way to handle that new paradigm. And it might even go so far as to say it's enabled that new paradigm to even exist in the first place.
Okay, that's good. All right. So to kind of follow up with that, I thought I'd get your point of view here on, you know, why do you think embedded Linux at the onset, you know, say 12, 13 years ago, kind of started to become popular? What were the drivers there that kind of made embedded Linux the compelling thing? So, for example, the T-shirt for the ELC later this week is, you know, have you ever used, you know, TV, blah, 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 and then a thank you at the end because, you know, embedded Linux is being used everywhere. So what kind of prompted this?
I can sum that up in one word.
Sure.
Royalties.
That's awesome.
Or lack thereof.
Or lack thereof. That's a good point.
Well, yeah, royalties is a big deal. I was CTO at Lineo.
Yep. Really?
Which is it's an embedded company. You may have heard of it. It's gone now. And in the early days, in like 1999, 98, somewhere in there, you know, when we were out there trying to sell Linux in the embedded space, it was kind of hard. But the compelling things were the royalties was a big issue, and the other thing was just the availability of the source.
Right.
The fact that once you got that source, you did not have to talk to your supplier again. And it's not that people didn't want to talk to their supplier. it's that they often could not talk to their supplier.
Right.
Right? It was, you know, getting the time of day from whoever provided you the bits, you know, and especially if you were a smaller shop. You know, the big companies can get, you know, support from their vendors, but the smaller companies, It was really hard. That's why you still see, in this chart, you see a lot of in-house stuff.
Right.
People wanting to see that.
You know,
Okay.
the other thing I would say is a lot of people make the assumption, I think, that with embedded often means real time.
Sure.
I mean, a lot of people I know have come to me and said, oh, you know, is it real-time Linux? And it's like, I think there's been a dawning realization that you can achieve the vast majority of what you want to achieve in embedded without a classically real-time sort of oriented system.
Sure.
I mean, there's certain applications that will, you know, require hard real-time guarantees and are happy to throw, you know, away latency, you know, for the, you know, essentially they can if they get the guarantee. I'm not a real-time guy, so I'm probably going to mess up. I'm going to mess up the definition. I've got one real-time guy that works for me, and I got to be careful. Every time I say something, he says, "No, Dave, it's this." I was like, "Oh yeah, right." But you know, that's some of the factor that I think has also helped Linux become, you know, certainly the source code and the lack of, you know, this is free and you get the source code, but also I think there's sort of that aspect. Hey, Linux is really capable in a lot of situations you might otherwise have had to buy, you know, a real-time system for. And the other factor is I think there are companies coming along now and providing a lot of the certifications that otherwise would have been, you know, whether they're safety certifications or government certifications, health certifications, et cetera. All of these now are, there's an ecosystem now that I think can deliver a lot of that.
Cool.
Real time means being fast enough.
Right.
So as long as you can meet your deadlines, the question is how much energy and how much money do you have to put into making that happen?
Right.
And I used to be a VxWorks guy a long time, helped contribute a lot to the VxWorks kernel back in the day. And so when people first started talking about embedded Linux in like '98, we laughed.
Yeah, we know.
But then over time, we started seeing some significant changes. The preempt RT patch.
Right.
Someday maybe it'll actually make it totally into the kernel. Who knows? You know, but it's getting smaller and smaller, so we're making progress there. And one of the groups of my guys are working at NASA on the space refueling robot.
Sure.
And we're using embedded real time. Well, it's we're sitting on top of Xenomai, but we're sitting there and we're running Linux. I mean, that's
very cool.
In orbit. So
Awesome.
it's proven itself to be a reliable operating environment.
Absolutely. Zach?
Yeah, well, I think all those are valid reasons. I think one reason, in addition to those, is that Linux is fun. And, you know, most of these distributed, or not distributed, but disruptive technologies come about because, you know, an engineer at some company, you know, is looking for, you know, they like to do fun things.
Right.
And they may have, you know, Linux is a hobby, and they think, oh, well, I'll pull this hobby into my work, and they have a manager that's maybe a little more enlightened to the universe, or maybe it's just cheap, and is thinking, yeah, sure, that's great, let's do it. And so I think that, you know, there is that element of it's just a lot more fun to work on an embedded Linux system than it is to work on like a Win Mobile system. I mean,
Right.
you know, having put out a Win Mobile system, I can tell you.
So my next question is, given that, you know, given those things that have attracted people to embedded Linux, what's attracting people to Android?
You know, I'm not an Android guy, so I will admit that. So from my perspective of why, you know, I see some of that happening, I think there's an attractiveness to the familiarity of the UI.
Okay.
I don't think it's actually because of the App Store.
Sure.
Because I think although there are some applications where I think in automotive, for example, people would love to get access to Google Maps, right? And there's some challenges there, I understand. So, but I mean, relative to, generally speaking, how we've defined things, I think there's not as much an interest in the apps and services as much as there's, well, there's a familiarity. Somebody who was saying, well, you know, if you're doing a military application, you've got soldiers who are 18 to 24, and they've got, you know, they're used to the pinchy, zoomy, swirly thingy thing. You know, then that's, oh, well, let's just, you know, throw that over. So I absolutely see that as an attractive element. The flip side of it, though, is, you know, it's easy, and I'll be kind of blunt, I think it's easy to hack something together, right? And the challenge, I think, is since most normal humans don't get insight into what Google is going to do with Android, because it's not a true,
Absolutely.
what I would
Does
consider.
anybody really get insight as to what Google's going
Well, I
to
don't know. I don't know.
I'm not sure that anybody
No.
here has a lot of
But
insight.
there may be some Google people who could, I don't know. But the
No, they won't.
okay. So it's always possible within this Linux sort of heritage that we have to, it's fun. You can always hack something together, right? And that's, I think, probably true of Android as well. Take the latest dessert-flavored release, and you've got something that you can put together. But when the next one comes out and all the middleware has changed, all of your stuff will have to get redone. And what we're trying to do with the Octo project is actually for, I think engineers, if they go beyond saying, okay, I can want to, maybe put something together, but I want a sustaining business. If I'm going to have to redo what I'm going to, do for the next thing and redo it again, most engineers would rather eat the muzzle of a revolver rather than actually have to do that, right? You want to actually engineer things that are repeatable, that actually are efficient. And so this is one of the driving purposes around something like the Octo project, which has, portability around these layers and
Right.
complete transparency. If we're changing a package version or changing approach, everything is totally transparent and people can comment on it, and if they don't like it, it's very easy to override through the layer architecture, any of that stuff. So I want to make but basically that's one of the things I think is really, you can always hack something together.
Right.
But do you really want to have a career of constantly redoing that stuff with the next dessert that gets thrown at you?
Sure.
But I think you can't underestimate the familiarity aspect of it. I mean, as somebody who's involved a lot in training, it's being able to drop a new industrial piece of equipment onto a factory floor and have somebody walk up to it and go, oh, I know how to work this. The Pinchy Zoomy thing is an important, UI. I mean, that's an important user experience piece.
Right.
So it's a familiarity that people just go, oh, okay, I instinctively know how this works. Let me run the Angry Birds app while I'm pressing this, piece of aluminum.
Cool.
Well, okay, so from my perspective, one of the big significant effects that Android has had on the embedded Linux space is that all of the silicon vendors do an Android port first, right? Probably before they do X or Wayland or anything else. And so you see, and there are still GPUs
Not
that
necessarily.
are close. Well,
Every silicon vendor.
not
but,
every.
but keep going. But keep going. Keep telling me what we, keep going, Tim.
Present
Well,
company accepted.
I mean, I won't, we could talk about what Intel does,
Yeah,
but
anyway.
we'll get to that.
But
But there are a lot of ports available. There are a lot of ports available.
There are a lot of ports, and so what you see is a lot of silicon vendor support for the Android stack. Particularly a thorny issue is the support for the video
Right.
chip or IP block, whatever it's going to be. And so a lot of people using Android other than in phones is coattailing, right? Is you don't want, if I'm developing something from scratch, I don't want to go write a video driver.
Right.
And they eventually show up in the open source community under kind of standard embedded Linux, but sometimes it takes longer, depending
Right.
on the chip.
So the availability of the support for the various silicon pieces is a driver there.
Certainly, if you take a look at what's happened over the past few years, Android has been the club that has finally gotten some of the most uncooperative silicon vendors to finally come to the table. But that has been the club that's finally gotten them
Gotcha.
to realize that open source is not the evil empire.
Gotcha. Zach?
Microsoft is.
Right.
I think transparency is fine. I think
Anyway, I think the most important thing, the reason why people are moving to Android is that all that actually doesn't matter. What matters is the API level.
Okay.
And the apps is king. App ecosystem is the only thing that matters.
So the API is what's driving people to actually use Android then?
There is a clear value proposition there.
Okay.
There is a clear ability to say, I can take and build a platform that people can monetize and people can then write apps against. And I totally disagree. You do not need to know how the sausage is made to eat the sausage. And in fact, the only thing you need to know in the Android platform is what the API level is. And then well, the API level isn't going to change. or is going to be backwards compatible. And if you look at how Android's put together, the API level is the contract with the user. And in fact, Google intentionally does not document how the platform's put together because they don't want people to violate the API contract. Because as soon as somebody violates the API contract, they are no longer in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
So, and from an application developer's perspective, they don't care how it's put together. They don't care how the video gets from A to B. They know that if they call one of the, an RTP video stream interface on their Java, on this Java class that's been exposed to them, they know it's going to work.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question, because I'm, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, right, that depends, right? If they're doing their own hardware, then they are going to have to know the low-level bits, right? And so if you're using COTS, off-the-shelf hardware, fine. You can just stick to the Android APIs. But I mean, you've got to do some system work if you're building your own board and if you're trying to shave, cents off of the hardware designs.
The other question I was going to raise was
Something I'm familiar with.
yeah, right. Something I was going to say is I've heard, again, not being an Android guy, but I've heard that there are plenty of tablets without any cell connection that still have dialers, right, in them, right? So you go, it's...
Well, yeah, in Froyo, you couldn't pull the dialer out even if you didn't want it. So
Okay.
you had to hide it somehow.
Okay, so this is so what I've heard, again, I'm not an Android guy, but what I've heard people say is that, the sort of, monolithic nature of it makes it really tough to pull stuff out. And then when you do want to, to either save on boot time or footprint or any of those sort of things, which is kind of a constraint. Not everybody has a, Xeon class processor for their embedded, although a few do.
Yeah.
We're
Well, which
happy
actually
about that.
brings me to the next question, which is, okay, so these are kind of like the drivers bringing people to Android. What's the drawbacks of using Android? When you're going to choose to use Android, what are you taking with you?
Really big footprint. And if you stick to Java, I'm sorry, but the JIT is slower than native. I mean, so you're
Okay, so speed,
you're gonna,
footprint.
speed and performance. It's classic trade-off. It's the embedded trade-off of historical embedded trade-off that we've all dealt with, which is how much time do I spend paring stuff down in order to reduce things like the amount of RAM I need or
Right.
the megahertz that I need on my CPU versus can I just take stuff off the shelf. There was a really interesting thing that happened a couple of years ago. There was actually the very first video advertisement in a magazine that what they did was it was an Android. Someone had gotten a very inexpensive Android phone and stuck the board inside the page.
Yeah. Was it a? Yeah, I remember that.
But there was a limited edition,
It's a
right?
magazine.
Because,
yeah.
it was a magazine ad that was
Yeah.
running video ads,
Yep.
and they just took Android and it was a very
It was a
thin
cell phone. Yeah.
cell phone that was stuck in the page, and they
Wow.
had turned off. It wasn't doing Wi-Fi or it wasn't networked, but it was doing all those page displays. But it was $50. And so it was a limited edition magazine run. You had to get like the first 1,000 issues of this magazine.
Right.
But so that's the trade-off, right? You're not going to see $5 for that if you're talking about a processor that's capable of running the whole stack.
Okay.
And so that's your cost, right?
So
Sure.
I kind of have a counterpoint to that, which is I think that if you look at the applications that embedded Linux has covered, right? Let's separate out MMU-less and MMU, right? If I've got an MMU and I'm running Linux anyway, I've got a certain class of embedded system, and I think that Android fits all of those systems because you can get Android down into a 64 megabyte RAM if you want to.
That's okay. My digital still cameras at Sony are at 32 meg, so sorry. So other than all digital cameras,
I mean that aside, I don't think that there's anything in Android that actually precludes you from going really low.
Well, I don't know. All you had to do was sit in Kareem's presentation yesterday or Sasha's presentation later to see the 7 layers of software that keep you from the hardware. And all that software, whether it's written in C++ or Java, takes up memory. And as we see now with ICS and later, if you don't have a high-end GPU, I'm sorry, you're not running ICS, at least not in a way that a user is going to be able to tolerate for very long.
That's
So-
actually not, that's not completely true, though, because with I mean, you can do, if you really wanted to, you can do a software rendered UI on a lower resolution screen, and that becomes actually pretty viable as you have as you have these more powerful SoCs that are continually coming out.
Yeah,
You don't even need to necessarily hook up to the
yeah.
GPU.
Dr. Moore has really helped us, you know, a lot of these things, but certain technologies don't actually Moore all that well, you know. So anyway, yeah.
But I mean, your original question is, you know, what is bad about
Yeah, so
about Android?
So we mentioned the footprint. I think that's a valid point. Maybe I can get you guys to elaborate, say, on the, and we talked about the complexity of the stack, maybe about the community angle or lack thereof.
Oh yeah, yeah. Don't get me started on the community. Well, so okay, so if you're gonna, there's not currently, to my knowledge, and maybe you're working on this, but there's not a community effect for like headless Android,
Yeah,
right?
it's
right?
difficult.
You're riding on the coattails of Google, and you get whatever the next release of Android that Google puts out. That's what you're going to get.
Sure.
And because of the nature of that, it's really hard to create a community around it, right? Because one of the big aspects of working in the open source community is being able to push things that you want in the future upstream.
Right.
And you don't have guarantees there. Well, you don't have guarantees in the regular community either, but it's a little bit more open. You got a fighting chance, and so I think that's a big issue is whether or not there's going to be a community to support. Like, suppose you wanted to do something like add Toybox to a headless Android situation, right? So Google's doing Toolbox, and you know they will probably never adopt Toybox, so they may or may not. But it's out there, and even if you put a whole bunch of work into it, you'd have to maintain it on the side. And so there's a whole issue. There's kind of an extra layer of development effort that would go along with building a community around Android.
And I think here's the other thing that I sort of think about. I really resist the idea of saying transparency is a who cares, particularly in this room where the Linux Foundation is, the whole concept is based on the premise that a community effect, that transparency, that cooperation is the power behind Linux. Frankly, I've been in the industry long enough, not as long as Mike apparently, but because my first project was an 8088 based one, not an 8086. So that's wow, that's pretty impressive. But you show it well, show it well. But I would say, I've seen enough companies that people go, oh, this company's never going away. They're always going to be there. And, honestly, I look at what's Google monetizing. Now, I don't know Google, and I love them. They're a great company. I got an Android phone. I love my Android phone. It's awesome. But if the time were ever to come where they would just say, we're not interested in doing this thing anymore, we're really we're kind of left holding the bag, which I think that one of the powers of the open source community is one in which, we're able to cooperate together. And I'm not saying that this is going to happen today or whenever. Who knows? Any company could decide to, make a change, right? You never know. But I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about a cooperative environment, that we can work together for that stuff. I was going to also address your question about whether chips, every silicon manufacturer comes out with Android first. I thought I would, one of the things that we try and do with our chips is we try and really make it up to a customer's choice. So if somebody wants to pick even Windows embedded, okay, all right, not my deal, man. But if they want to pick Android for any application, that's what we really want to encourage people to do. And we want to make sure it runs best on Intel. That's just true of also Linux. We do a lot of upstream contribution to Linux not only with Atom and Core and Xeon, all of those processors really make sure they all run Linux. We're hoping best, right? So we do a lot of upstream work relative to that. But so yeah, if a customer wants to do something, we're okay with it. But we sort of love the opportunity to work together with even competitors and a whole sort of ecosystem on something that really will succeed. That's kind of why we're focusing in embedded on the Octa project.
Yeah, well, from my perspective with the embedded piece, when you start adding PWMs and exporting I2C and SPI and all the industrial controls that go along with that. Now you're talking about things that, have you ever tried to modify libsensors to add a totally different sensor than what Google thought should be in a phone? That's not a trivial thing to do. And so from does Android replace, especially headless Android, replace an embedded Linux environment, it's not trivial to add a totally new type of sensor to Android. So, if you're going to try and put it in a refrigerator or a washing machine or a temperature sensor, you need to be able to do barometric pressure for whatever reason. This is not an easy thing to do in Android unless you're willing to really dig into the AOSP and understand how it's all put together, which is why you sell your book, right?
There's an appendix about that. You want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, so I tend to agree with David, and in terms of this, one bad thing about Android is kind of once you go Android, you're in Android. You need to port libraries by and large. You need to think and design your software to use Android, which is not necessarily a platform at that point, but you're adopting the Android operating system, the Android object-oriented operating system, which is at the core of the Android system, and that is a fundamental change. It's actually a fundamental difference in skill set.
Sure.
Because now I am no longer opening a POSIX pipe to talk between daemons, right? I'm writing a Java service that's going to serve activities that I'm also going to write. It takes that level of abstraction and has shifted it. And so I think, what I see when companies choose to go with Android it's kind of a one-way ticket. And I think companies that do adopt Android and say, we're going to re-architect our existing software to make use of the native platform, I think they reap a lot of benefits from doing that because of the way things are constructed. But it is a one-way trip.
Sure. Okay. So, and kind of leapfrogging on that, so one of the things that first struck me when I kind of approached Android, I got into Android thinking, hey, this is embedded Linux. This is going to be easy, right? And as Mike said, you get the layer cake. So I was wondering if I could get your opinion on the fact that Android has rewritten some major things that we've been using in the embedded Linux world for forever, right? So stuff like BasicBox got rewritten as Toolbox, glibc and microclibc got rewritten as Bionic, and there's quite a few other things.
I have a very strong opinion on this.
Okay, go ahead.
And it's actually, maybe surprising people, it's very positive. I think when I first looked at the Android stack, it was such a breath of fresh air. It was like I'm not trying to wedge Unix into the embedded space anymore. It was like designed from scratch, from the ground up, with embedded issues in mind.
Okay.
And so, the fact that it's not strictly POSIX doesn't, it bothers some people, but it's like, they've discarded some of the POSIX badging because this doesn't need to be here anymore. They did Toolbox for kind of dumb, not dumb. They did that for license reasons, right?
Yeah, I don't want to get to that later on, but right.
So, but the other stuff, like some of the stuff they did around application lifecycle, with intents and the message passing is neat stuff, and like the way they handle crashes, the way they did the logging is different than traditional Linux, and it's way better for the embedded space.
Right.
And so I've been wanting to see a lot of that stuff pulled back and somehow put into non-Android stacks. There's a lot of really good ideas in the Android stack.
Mm-hmm. Somebody else? No? All right. So kind of going from there, what can embedded Linux, so to speak, learn from Android, and vice versa, in fact? What can Android kind of learn from embedded Linux?
Well, I think that Android, the reason that Android was positioned at the right place at the right time was because, quite frankly, in the embedded Linux space, we couldn't make our mind up as to what the UI looked like. You know, is it cute? Is it GTK? What is it? If you can't figure out what the user experience is going to be, you're not going to be successful. You
Sure.
can't really master something. And so Android was at the right place at the right time with the kind of user experience and, quite frankly, taking into account the skill sets that are available from programmers coming out of school today. You know, the universities aren't teaching people how to work in reduced footprint environments terribly well. So as far as they're concerned, CPU cycles are infinite, memory is infinite, storage is infinite.
They aren't?
And
Everything has a swap.
everything has a swap, and everything runs in a VM. So Android is perfectly positioned for that kind of mindset.
It's interesting you bring up the UI thing because that's something which has been kind of challenging. I think when you think about you've got a big iOS ecosystem of app developers that are not using Java, right? And that's you've got the Android app ecosystem, and then there's an emerging piece that I don't think the final page. I don't think we should close the patent office on that one yet.
Oh, no.
Because one of the things I think is real interesting to see is some of the developments with HTML5
Yeah.
as an example. And so that has a kind of a real potential, I think, to be very nice cross-platform sort of capability for app development, for UI development. So I wouldn't necessarily think the door is closed on that one. One of the things I think is that we've tried, when you think about kids coming out of school, a lot of them are actually learning C++. So Qt is actually a very interesting alternative. A lot of kids in other schools are coming out really involved with Linux, and so the whole GNOME mobile area is very powerful. What we've tried to do in the Octave project is trying to support all of them, and not said, okay, this is the one way you got to do things to get the best sort of support. We've tried to bring the best of the community in, so you can develop applications on the Octave using Qt. You can, and I got a really great C++ guy that's on board, maintaining that stuff, right? We've have people who are, and the HTML5 thing I think is incredibly powerful as well. We're going to have a talk this week actually on some digital signage things based on HTML5, which in theory you could replace with a number of different OSs, but I think that sort of captures that kind of investment that I think will be there going forward. So you're right. That is a powerful thing from Android that I think positioning Java from that sort of sense. It's interesting to see that 20-year-old technology get a breath of fresh air a little bit. So we'll sort of see how that materializes.
The future of Java in general has me a bit concerned at this point. When we look at Oracle and what they're doing with Java or not doing, they've got a lot of security holes that they're not fixing. Is the Java ecosystem then going to transition to just what you can do on Dalvik, and Google takes the reins of that?
Right.
Where does the open source community come into play in the features of the language and keeping it moving forward? Or does Java become the next COBOL?
Zach, you want to take a stab at that?
COBOL, maybe Fortran.
Maybe Fortran's still alive and well.
And COBOL's alive and well. Actually, I heard.
That's horrible.
I hear if you are a COBOL programmer in the financial district in New York, you can make a pretty good lot of money.
Your own ticket, geez.
So what do you think,
Well, I think-
Zach? And
I think that embedded Linux, I actually think embedded Linux has nothing really technical to learn from Android, but I think it has some things, some higher level things
Okay.
that it could learn. One, the first priority is that the highest priority is the ecosystem. Being able, and not Linux developers and things like that. That ecosystem will survive no matter what.
sure,
It's the ecosystem of app developer to user.
sure.
And the second priority is how do I reduce the time to market to take widget thing in new SOC thing and connect app developer and user. If I can get that down to where we're currently at with the Android space, where you can pretty much turn an Android device in the time it takes to build a slide deck, then we're ready to go. And I think the third thing is that existence proofs are very big. And being able to take a system that has seen 1 billion users make my little change and insert that into that ecosystem and know that I'm going to be okay, that's huge.
Right.
People use Android because it has worked in the past and it will work in the future. And whether Google goes bust or whatever, I mean, it's kind of irrelevant. I mean, that's like saying if Intel goes bust.
It
Or
could
it's
happen.
like saying
I mean, it could happen.
Intel?
there's
I hope I'm dead by the time it happens. By the way, my children. I hope I can get that through college. But,
right.
That's my hope. But yeah, we'll entertain that idea. You know, may
But
happen.
I mean, Android's a particular solution to the problem of delivering a service from somebody wants to create it to somebody who wants to consume it. And it's just a very effective and efficient way to do that.
Yeah, I don't think you can underestimate the paradigm shift of the App Store
Sure.
or iTunes, whatever. I mean, try to go into a Fry's or a Best Buy today and buy software.
Right.
You can't. They
Yeah.
don't sell it. It just doesn't work.
Right.
So, but by that same token, you have to understand that has also changed the model for what people are willing to pay for those
this.
apps.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, if Microsoft decides to sell Microsoft Office on iOS, they cannot charge $500 for an app. People aren't willing to pay that. They're down in the area where they say, well, I'm willing to pay maybe $15 or $20.
Right.
So it has completely changed the monetization for how app vendors can then sell things and the prices that they can expect to get
Right.
off of those apps.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And I was wondering if I could get your take on the licensing in general. You know, so one of the things that Android did was kind of like start from a clean slate, if nothing else, for licensing reasons. So, you know, whereas the traditional embedded Linux stack that we're used to has a lot of GPL and LGPL components, the Android stack is mostly based on BSD and Apache. Do you think that has, you know, benefits and, you know, pros and cons? What are the pros and cons of that having happened, essentially?
Okay, so it does have an effect on how companies perceive their responsibilities relative to the open source community. And without going into specifics, I know of companies that when they make out their, you know, when they go through their GPL obligations, they go through their license obligations, and quite frankly, I don't know if anyone's ever done this, but when you ship a product, a modern product, there's a spreadsheet that goes along with it that has the license for all the different components. And I know Yocto's working on SPDX, but it's a big thorny issue. And currently, I know that companies, when they see the BSD license, they are happy about that, but they also, it doesn't compel them to push stuff upstream
True.
or to publish it. And I do worry that it ends up, you know, there's a lot of good changes that are being done by companies that are not getting published because of the license. And
True.
so it's a concern going forward. It's hard to say, you know, you don't know what companies are doing. And so
Right.
you don't know how much of technology is getting lost or not shared. You know, it's an unknown, but it is a worry.
Yeah, I mean, Tim's right. A lot of what we're doing, the Octo project, is trying to be, because there is so much abuse of licenses actually that are going on in embedded, I think. There are a number of companies putting out devices where you can't get sources for the GPL, even the kernel
Yep,
bits.
absolutely.
Right. So what we've really been trying to do is be kind of an example setter relative to, you know, if you produce the image, you can also produce the complete source archive. You can also have the complete license manifest. So you can generate those things automatically. You know, some of and I think GPL has been pretty powerful to build the community effect. And I just think about operating systems that have been based on BSD in the past. BSD is one of them, you know, and we see where it is now. I mean, I got my start my first Unix was, 4.2 BSD on a VAX, right? So there was a lot that I kind of remember from that era, but it's like, it's the multiplicative effect haven't been there. Now, the other piece of, that has been worrying some people is GPL version 3. as because of the changes there. I'm a strong advocate of the GPL and all of its versions and flavors, but some people have difficulty because of the anti-TVOization factor in GPL v3. It's one of the reasons why we build a version. We can either have GPL v3 or not. It's very easy to put a one line in the configuration file or a checkbox on the UI and say build with no GPL v3,
Sure.
and that we're able to produce that piece, which comforts some people, right? So that's, I think I think the community effect of what we're doing with the Octo project has really, dealt with some of those license issues, any concerns that people have, and I think there's a lot of success that people are having with it.
Well, I think that by that same token, you see that there are many cases, for instance, as somebody who works with customers to build new devices,
Right.
if I want to build a new device based on, say, OMAP 4, and OMAP 4 has that PowerVR graphics chip in it, and if there's any problem with a codec or something that's not playing nice with that PowerVR graphics chip, I'm screwed.
Yep.
I can't get access to the source. I can't fix it. I have to tell the customer, sorry, your codec just isn't going to work because the guys at PowerVR aren't cooperative enough to be able to give me enough information to be able to fix your problem. So I think that there is some impact of people hiding behind the BSD and the Apache license to keep you from being able to do the job you need to do. Not that they're deliberately trying to keep me from selling product, but
No, I understand. Zach?
I think licensing issues are kind of a red herring in the whole discussion.
Okay.
I think that market pressure will trump any licensing issues that people actually run up against. And if there is a economic incentive to use a GPL v3 component, it will happen. Because at the end of the day, that, the ability to ship product overrides those things. And in fact, I'd say that very argument is what brought Linux into embedded anyway, which was the economic incentive to not pay licensing fees or to be able to have access to the source was so strong that companies who would just say, this is our IP, we developed this,
Right.
would forego that in an attempt to beat their competitors to market with something. And I think what we see is I'd say in 5 years where software is going in the exact wrong direction that Microsoft wants it to go. It's become everywhere. And that's a win for the open source world, right? We may dicker about licensing, and SPDX, you can go through and do the full analysis of, well, does this license preclude this license and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, I think companies are finding that they can make more money producing services as opposed to software. And so I think what that does is they say, well, we don't care, release the source. There's no IP in there. All the cool IP that we did, we squirreled that away in the chip. And so I think you see, for good or for ill, what you see with the GPL is you see essentially the GPL caused all the fun bits to go into silicon.
Well, just take the point that I think in graphics is a perfect example how that's not the case, right? And that's a real struggle that people have had. I think actually, some of the AMD and Intel graphics chips that are finally have open source, drivers as examples out there have shown that a lot of times there's a laziness factor that goes into. I have this incestuousness between the low-level hard software and hardware designers and things of that sort. So there's a certain amount of struggle there. The reality every one of us live with, though, is the fact that, as you said, there are closed-source graphics drivers out there that make it extremely difficult. Yeah, okay. You're right.
15W.
Yeah, you're right. It's a challenge. You're right. And so they exist as a factor. And you say if it's economically viable, right? Well, that doesn't really help the little guy if they're the little guy or gal who's trying to make their living based on something. Well, it's not economically viable for me to go and obviously address a customer's needs. So they got to go to somebody really huge. It seems like that's kind of incredible. So I actually think there are strong motivations. You're right, Zach, as there's a strong motivation, I think, for software, free software to really, help a lot of businesses to do amazing things. And charging for software doesn't seem to be as strong of an issue. Although being able to charge for services, for support, for a lot of those capabilities, I think is pretty powerful. So.
All right, cool. So if we didn't kind of address the question of a replacement of embedded Linux, how about kind of having them coexist? Is there any value in a developer actually using a classic embedded Linux stack side by side with an Android stack?
Absolutely. I've done it both ways, where I've had a Linux Chroot running side by side with Android. I mean, the key is the kernel. As long as we have the kernel and the kernel is the same, then I can mix GPL or LGPL libraries, squirrel it off into a subdirectory someplace, and then run Android right side by side with Linux. I've also done the other thing where I've got an Android piece on a Linux box. The Linux box boots up and does all of its hard or softish real-time things.
Right.
And then we use Android as the UI. You can do both, and you can counter-mix. You can mix them and mingle the two of them together if you understand the overall architecture for both of them,
right,
and how they overlap or don't overlap in the case, as the case may be.
Yeah, I think running Android in a VM is another option, right? That's since virtualization is now becoming more and more of a reality with a lot of chips. I think running, in fact, someone was telling me about, you could run, their automotive system, put the the Android games in the back seat and running on a VM, but run the critical car systems on on a Linux basis. There's at least one company I know of, and I may be getting the name wrong, but I'm at the risk of getting the name wrong. I think it's OpenMobile that has a product that will actually is an Android application compatibility running on Linux. And I think they're doing. I'd love to give props to them. I don't really know them well enough to know, but I think they're probably going for market access. So, like you were saying, the app ecosystem piece, which I don't think is actually that relevant for most embedded applications. So, it may be you just want the UI, right, and those sort of things, as opposed to the full Monty. So
I want Angry Birds when I'm doing the laundry.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
My wife.
Yes, of course.
You will do the laundry, so I might as well be.
Might as well do, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the points regarding to the API is the access to a developer community of people that know that API, not so much the app itself.
Well, there's also the tools, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
the
tools are pretty good.
Right, the tools are pretty good.
Yeah, I like what they've done just recently, where they've bundled everything together. One download, you get Eclipse, you get everything.
You get everything.
It's all nice and packaged.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a huge benefit over. I think they do that.
Zach, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I would hate for traditional embedded Linux to go away.
Okay.
Because traditional embedded Linux is how we develop. I mean, it's how you need BusyBox. You need a more capable general purpose system to be able to bootstrap Android in a lot of ways. I mean,
right.
Anybody who's tried to sit down and do kernel development in an Android platform will tell you it is not going to work. We need all of our tools. Where's our tools? Where's our, and I mean, Barrow has kept from Linaro has kept this great perf for Android, patch set going for a while. We're trying to get that upstream, and it's just, embedded Android is a lot, or embedded Linux is a lot of fun, and it's an extremely useful way to put together systems.
Sure.
And I think that as embedded, I think at the core of the argument is it's not an either or thing.
Right.
And that a healthy ecosystem rises all boats rise, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that it behooves everyone to, work close together, kind of say, I mean, we're all competing and we're all cooperating, and it's this great world where we live in where we're able to do that. But at the end of the day, we're all running Linux.
Right, right. And which gets me kind of like the last question, and we're kind of short on time here, so I'm going to ask you to make it quick, even though it's the most important question. So, do you ever see a horizon where Android would completely wipe embedded Linux out of the map, or at least the embedded Linux as we know it? No.
No.
No. Is that quick enough?
It's quick enough. Zach?
Well,
He gets the last word.
I'm going to make this point. One thing I kind of go back to people that, before the invention of the loom, right? You had artisans that would craft textiles.
Right.
Well, the loom standardized how you created textiles. Android standardizes how you create software components. And now we're kind of entering this new world where we don't do so much software engineering as we do software manufacturing.
Okay.
And so I think that embedded Linux as it is today will become less and less viable as a way forward. And I think Android has introduced that so that the traditional person sitting down, putting their platform together, packing it together, and putting a product out, I think those days are either gone or they're numbered.
You could be from Microsoft saying that. I'm sorry, that's true. That sounds like exactly something you'd hear Bill Gates say. Sorry, it's really cool, like, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I want to be able to still run on top of an ARM 926, you know, an L138. I want to be able to
I want to run on an
Power
ARM
PC,
ARM M3. So
you know, Cortex
There you go.
M3. You know, there's a lot of requirement for those types
Cortex
of products.
M3 is never running Android. Well, okay. That's going to be a Bill Gates quote, right?
That's
Sometime in
right.
the future.
Okay, that's cool. So we're kind of very short on time here for questions, but I'd like to see if we can get one or two questions. There are mics in the aisles here. If you can just get up to the mic if you have any questions for our panel here.
Or not.
Or not. Okay, well, thank you very much. Oh, there's one question? All right. I'm sorry, you're going to have to grab the mic.
You see there is a need to define what is an Android system from hardware perspective. You know, if you are going to deliver the apps that run on any Android platform that depends on, say, BLE being there, or depending on what Mike was talking about for accessories, that your device should be supporting USB host. So is there, do you guys think there is a need for defining what an Android system from hardware point of view is? I mean, we have defined it from the software API, but we
Right.
haven't defined it what
From
it needs to
the
be
hardware
added.
standpoint.
Well, I think the CTS pretty much describes, if it doesn't run the CTS, then it's not going to be Android from that perspective.
Right.
But when you start talking about putting sensors out there, that's always going to be, that's not a generic device. That's not a generic Android device. You're tuning it for a specific application. And once you start doing that, then you basically don't have the ability to run it on everything.
One last question. Any takers? There's one over here.
The original Galaxy Nexus only had 2 binary blobs, one for the graphics and one for the radios. The Nexus 7 has 6, and it seems like an alarming trend where you have more and more and more binary blobs. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
I'd like to comment on that. So one thing first, I think most people in this room owe a big debt of gratitude to JBQ from Android, who by and large keeps AOSP going and enables a lot of this to actually happen. Android's an interesting ecosystem even within Google. JBQ has always said, I hate binary blobs. But the SoC vendors say, well, I want to protect my IP, so we're going to ship with binary blobs. But if you look at Nexus as a platform, the goal has been to have a zero binary blob build. And if you look at, I believe it's which one is it? The Nexus 10. I think if you look at no, it's not the Nexus 10. But anyway, the goal for JBQ is to have a completely open device. And that's a good goal for the person that is releasing all of the software, and is a real driving goal or force behind that. So yeah, I think it's just Google is having to deal with how the SoC manufacturers want to deliver their enablement.
All right. Well, thank you very much, folks. Thank you, guys, and enjoy the day.